They pierced my hands and my feet is a straight up mistranslation of Psalm 22:16. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and for a very long time Christians have understood Psalm 22:16 as a prophecy about a form of execution that didn't exist when this psalm was supposed to have been written, specifically crucifixion. And more specifically, this is supposed to be a prophecy about the crucifixion of Jesus. The imagery of hands and feet being pierced is supposed to evoke the crucifixion. And this is supposed to be confirmed in the minds of a lot of Christians by the fact that while he was on the cross, Jesus was supposed to have cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is the very beginning of Psalm 22. The only problem is Psalm 22:16 does not say they pierced my hands and my feet, and there is no plausible way to reconstruct any such reading from any of the ancient manuscripts. So here is Psalm 22:16 from the Masoretic text. It says verse 17 because this is one of those places where the versification is slightly different from the English. And you see in the red box three words, Ka'ari, Yadai, Varaglai. And the word on the right, Ka'ari, means like a lion, Kaf, Aleph, Resh, Yod. And that is two different words, the inseparable preposition kaf, which means as or like, and then the word for lion. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, which is what leads a lot of scholars to think that there has probably been some kind of corruption to the text. Something is missing, something has been altered. Now, if we go look in the Septuagint, they use the verbal root orisan, which means to dig or hollow out. That's not what we have in the Hebrew. But if we removed the aleph and we changed the yod to a vav, we could have they dug or they hollowed out my hands and my feet. But that also doesn't make sense. But before we get to why, there is a reading from the Dead Sea Scrolls that gets halfway to that reading. You can't really see what's going on very well in the red box in this manuscript, but it is four letters, Kaf, Aleph, Resh, and then what seems to be a Vav. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the difference between a Yod and a Vav was usually how long they were. The Vav was longer. However, it was more of a spectrum than a dichotomy because there are many places where the reading has to be Vav, but the Vav is shorter than other places where the reading has to be Yod. So it could plausibly be a Yod. However, I agree with the majority of scholars who say this is probably supposed to be a Vav. The problem is there is no verbal root, Kaf, Aleph, Resh. That just doesn't exist in Hebrew. So this doesn't really help us. We would have to further postulate the removal of the Aleph to give us Kaf, Resh, Vav, which would then be the verbal root Kara, which means, as you can see here from Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, to hollow out, dig. This does not mean to pierce, and this is the main issue. You cannot plausibly render pierce for this verbal root, and there are a number of reasons why. I will go over the three main reasons. The first is that the semantic focus and range of this verbal root has to do with removing material in a way that focuses either on the material that is removed or on the surface or the space that is left by the removal of that material. So conceptually, this has nothing to do with driving something through something else. Another reason is that this verbal root never takes the material as it exists before the removal as the direct object of the verbal action. In other words, you do not kara the ground. You kara a pit in the ground. You kara a tomb in stone. You kara dirt from the ground. You do not kara the ground. Similarly, you do not kara hands and feet. And there's an additional reason. Hands and feet are small and rather flat, and there's not a lot of space. So you can't dig hands any more than you can dig a sheet of paper. That's just not how they use this word. But rather than just trust that this hollowed entry demonstrates this cannot mean to pierce, let's take a look at every single occurrence of the verbal root kara in the entire Hebrew Bible. There are not a lot of them. Here's one page. You can see up at the top, Genesis 26:25, dug a well. 50, verse 5, the tomb that I hewed out. That's the verbal root kara. Exodus 21:33, digs a pit. Numbers 21:18, the well that the leaders sank, that the nobles of the people dug. Jeremiah 18:20, they have dug a pit. Jeremiah 18:22, they have dug a pit. The rest of the occurrences, 2 Chronicles 16:14, the tomb that he had cut out, kara, for himself. Psalm 7:15, they make a pit or dig a pit. Psalm 40 verse 6, you have given me an open ear. Here it's literally dug an ear. And that does not mean dug into an ear. It means dug out an ear. This is idiomatic. The idea is that they have removed material that allows for hearing to occur. Psalm 57:6, dug a pit. Psalm 94:13, a pit is dug. Psalm 119:85, dug pitfalls for me. The most complex use of this verb occurs in Proverbs 16:27. Scoundrels concoct evil. Literally, it is kara ra'a. They dig evil. And here the idea is not that they dig into evil, but they dig up evil. They mine for evil. They dredge for evil. In other words, the evil is what they are pulling out. So that's where the semantic focus is on the material that is removed. This is also very metaphorical. And then the very last occurrence, Proverbs 26:27, digs a pit. You cannot dig hands. You cannot dig feet. Now, you can dig hands out in the sense that maybe you dig out material and the material are hands and feet, but that's very clearly not crucifixion. So people are going to say that, well, driving nails through a hand could be understood this way. And there's just no case to make for that. There is no occurrence of this verbal root that can plausibly be interpreted to support that reading. You do not dig hands and feet at all, much less in a way that means pierce hands and feet. If they wanted to say, they pierced my hands and my feet, they would have used either the verbal root nakav, which begins at the bottom of a page in hollowed and then goes on to this lengthy entry, or more likely, in my opinion, ratzah, which as you can see at the bottom, to pierce through. And then the one occurrence of this verb in Exodus 21:6 actually talks about piercing through his ear. So you cannot get from what we have in the Hebrew, what we have in the Greek, what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we have in all our ancient manuscripts, to they pierced my hands and my feet. That is a mistranslation, pure and simple. As the text stands, it is corrupted in some way. Something is missing, something has been added, something has been changed. We don't know precisely what it says, but based on what we have in our Hebrew manuscripts, in our ancient Greek manuscripts, it cannot be translated, they pierced my hands and my feet. That is a mistranslation that is motivated entirely by the need to interpret it in light of the crucifixion, in light of the Christian gospel, in light of the notion that this has to be a prophecy about Jesus' crucifixion. And there's just no plausible case to make for that. They pierced my hands and my feet is a straight up mistranslation of Psalm 22:16. And the fit for this video has been Frog and Toad.